In July 1939, several months before the outbreak of the Second World War, the Lucindo family arrived in Serra do Gordo, a mining town in the state of Minas Gerais, Brazil. The family, consisting of João Lucindo, his 3 sons and his son-in-law, had come to the region with a specific purpose: to locate and extract deposits of mica, a valuable mineral ore used for export. Despite their persistent efforts and several attempts to find the precious material in the mountainside, they had so far come up empty-handed. The family had established a base camp on the mountainside where they were conducting their mining operations, pitching their tent about halfway up the slope. On this particular evening, João's youngest son, Vicente Lucindo, who served as the group's cook, faced the task of making the trek down to the bottom of the mountain to collect water. They would need it to prepare breakfast the following morning. Vicente gathered an empty bucket for carrying the water and took along a rifle, a sensible precaution in the remote wilderness. As he began his descent, the sky was already growing darker and the moon was beginning to make its appearance on the horizon. The journey to the water source was typically a routine, if somewhat laborious, chore that Vicente had completed many times before. Nothing about this evening suggested it would be any different from his previous trips. However, as he approached the spring at the base of the mountain, Vicente became aware of an unusual sound cutting through the quiet of the evening. It was a strange, prolonged hissing noise, unlike anything he had heard before in these surroundings. He couldn't begin to imagine what might be producing such a sound. Vicente paused and began scanning the area around him, trying to locate the source of the noise. Despite his careful examination of his surroundings, nothing appeared out of place or unusual. Eventually, he reached the edge of the spring and set his empty bucket down on the ground. By this point, darkness had settled in more completely than when he had first set out from the tent. Fortunately, the moon had risen high enough above the treetops to provide adequate illumination for him to see what he was doing. Still, despite his continued efforts to identify where the unsettling hissing sound was coming from, he couldn't pinpoint its origin or determine what could be making it. Aware that his father and brothers would be waiting for him back at the camp, Vicente decided to abandon his search and focus on the task at hand. He reached down for the bucket and began scooping water from the spring. At that moment, a new light suddenly illuminated the area around him. This wasn't the natural light of the moon. It had a strange, unnatural quality that immediately caught Vicente's attention. He dropped the bucket back to the ground and quickly grabbed his rifle. Spinning around with his rifle at the ready, Vicente prepared to fire if there was danger nearby. His first thought was that the artificially powered light might belong to other miners, perhaps more ruthless competitors who posed a threat. However, as he scanned the area behind him, he quickly determined that no one was there. He was completely alone. Yet something peculiar became apparent. Regardless of where he moved, he remained in the centre of a circle of light, which he later estimated to be approximately 15 feet across. Curious about this phenomenon, Vicente began to experiment. He moved a little way to the left, then to the right. Each time he repositioned himself, he found that he stayed exactly in the middle of the strange light, as if whatever was producing it was actively tracking his movements. Then the situation became even more bizarre. As Vicente continued moving back and forth, he noticed that his legs were becoming increasingly difficult to move. It felt as though his feet were glued to the floor. This sensation intensified until he found himself essentially frozen in place, unable to move at all. It was then that he noticed two figures emerging from the darkness, walking toward him. Still completely unable to move his body, Vicente watched as the two figures approached. Each stood approximately 6 feet tall and wore what appeared to be a metallic mesh covering their bodies from their feet to their necks. The brightness of the light prevented him from seeing the details of their faces clearly, but from what he could make out, they appeared to have normal, human-like features. Vicente then realized that the figures were making gestures toward him. Although he didn't understand why, he felt a sudden, powerful urge to look upward. When he did, he saw an object hovering approximately 150 feet above him. The object was shaped like an enormous plate and appeared to be rotating. Vicente suddenly understood that this object was the source of both the strange light that had been tracking him and the hissing sound he had heard earlier. He continued staring up at the round, dark object and noticed that a hatch of some kind had opened on its underside. In the next moment, he realized that one of the figures was standing beside him and had taken hold of his arm. Before he could process what was happening, both he and the figure began rising upward towards the strange craft. Vicente later recalled having the distinct feeling that he was being sucked in. Within seconds, he and the figure were inside what he would later describe as the mysterious ship. As Vicente looked around the interior of the craft, he observed what appeared to be an immense laboratory that seemed equipped for countless purposes. Moments after entering, he felt a sudden dullness settling over his senses, as if he had been given some kind of sedative. The figures then began removing his clothes and proceeded to conduct several tests and experiments on him. Throughout this entire experience, Vicente had a realization, though he didn't understand how he knew this information, that one of the figures had communicated to him that he wouldn't be harmed. Furthermore, he received the message that they would provide him and his family with a great benefit. Then, without warning, his surroundings changed in an instant. The next thing Vicente knew, he was standing outside his family's tent, halfway up the mountainside. He had the bucket with him, and it was full of water. His rifle was neatly packed away over his shoulder. Strangely, despite having apparently made the long, steep climb from the spring back to the tent, his legs felt no aches or tiredness whatsoever. Vicente then noticed his father and brothers, and they appeared to be preparing to go out searching for him. He must have been gone far longer than he realized. In that moment, he made a quick decision. Rather than tell them what had actually happened, he would claim that he was late because he had been chasing a paca, a type of rodent common to the region. He also remembered what the figure had told him about providing him and his family with a great benefit. He decided that if this benefit actually came to pass, whatever it might be, he would tell them the truth about his experience then. Shortly after Vicente's return to the tent, the family settled down for the night. Not surprisingly, Vicente found it extremely difficult to fall asleep. The bizarre events kept cycling through his mind repeatedly. He had a persistent feeling that he was on the verge of remembering specific details of what had happened inside the ship, but those memories continued to elude him. It was sometime near dawn when Vicente was in a state between being half asleep and half awake that one of those memories suddenly surfaced, the memory of the great benefit his family had been promised. Vicente suddenly recalled one of the figures telling him that he should open a tunnel on the other side of the mountain at exactly the same level where his family was currently working, and they would find an area that required little effort. The figure had continued, instructing him to follow the tunnel in a straight line toward the interior of the mountain. Once they reached a depth of 30 metres, they would find a lot of malacacheta ore. Vicente knew that although the figures had called it malacacheta, it was the same as the mica his family had been desperately seeking. He sat upright suddenly, realising he needed to act on this information. However, he was uncertain about how to inform his family about why they should mine on the other side of the mountain without revealing the truth about his encounter. He decided to tell them that he had had a strange dream about the location and that they should check to see if there was indeed an abundance of mica there. To Vicente's surprise, his father agreed to investigate. A short time later, at the exact location he had been told to mine, they discovered the tunnel. They began their work, and within a matter of weeks, they recovered an abundance of the valuable ore. At this point, Vicente revealed the truth to his family about his encounter with the strange figures, explaining that it was they who had informed him of the location. However, despite being pleased with their discovery, his family simply dismissed his version of events. They insisted that it must have been only a dream. Vicente, however, knew better. He remained firm in his account of what had happened that night in July 1939. He continued to maintain his version of events for the rest of his life, until his death in 1970, which occurred shortly after he revealed the encounter to researcher Abilio C. Coelho. The account would eventually appear in the wider public domain in Coelho's 1982 book, The History of Occultism. The Vicente Lucindo case stands as one of the most intriguing early alien encounter reports on record. What makes it particularly significant is that it occurred almost a decade before the start of the modern UFO era, which is generally considered to have begun with the Kenneth Arnold sighting in 1947 and the Roswell incident that same year. Vicente's experience in the late 1930s represents one of the earliest documented alien abduction cases, occurring at a time when such reports were virtually unheard of. The encounter contained elements that would become familiar in later abduction reports: the paralysis, the medical examination, the beings of humanoid appearance. Yet it also included an unusual aspect that sets it apart from most subsequent cases. Rather than simply being subjected to experiments and returned with nothing but disturbing memories, Vicente received information that led to genuine financial reward for his family. This element of compensation or beneficial exchange is notably absent from the typical abduction scenarios reported from the 1960s onward, particularly those involving the grey aliens that would become the most commonly reported entity type. The case raises questions about who these beings might have been, where they came from, and what their intentions were. Their actions don't fit neatly into the patterns established by later abduction reports, suggesting either a different group of visitors or a different purpose for their interaction with Vicente. The being's willingness to provide valuable information that would improve the Lucindo family's circumstances stands in stark contrast to the typical abduction narrative, where witnesses are left traumatized and confused, with no apparent benefit from their experience. Vicente Lucindo's encounter in Serra do Gordo remains a compelling case that challenges our understanding of when and how extraterrestrial contact with humans may have begun. If his account is accurate, it suggests that whatever was happening in the skies and mountains of Brazil in 1939 was part of a phenomenon with a longer history than is commonly acknowledged.